And I thought actually what I would do is just tell you about two of the discoveries that I made when I was researching this book, and then hear your questions and thoughts. The first one, this is a great place to talk about it in a partly tragic sense. I asked people when I talk about my book to compare Adams to his two successors in the White House. And I'm always a little worried, is anyone going to know who his two successors is president? But there's always at least one person who does know that, like Adams, John Adams, his successors, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, both died in these beautiful mansions that they had, in Jefferson's case, created, and in Madison's case, massively renovated and improved on, and had lived out, had a long retirement in those houses, as had Adams. And I have to say, by the way, what an amazing pleasure it is for me. Andrew, you're taking a picture of me, aren't you? Are you, Andrew? Yeah. Because my daughter is 4, and I can't wait to show her Daddy on the Nickel. Wearing, by the way, my Peter Jefferson Fry tie they gave me after I was here last time. Jefferson and Madison, as everyone in this group knows, died, both of them, so deep in debt that those beautiful mansions had to be sold to pay off their creditors. And this is a place of great tragedy, among many other things that it is, because you can imagine the families being sold on this spot and separated, in some cases, forever. Contrast that to Adams, who also died in this wonderful mansion of his that he'd retired to, but he died wealthy and debt-free. And the question is to compare those two Virginians to this New Englanders and ask why? What was so different about Adams? And we could name a lot of things. We could talk about what tobacco does to the soil. We could say that Jefferson's a bit more of a wine snob than Adams was, and so his wine bill was a bit bigger. We could say what a brilliant lawyer John Adams was, that he'd made so much money as a lawyer, but that's probably the theory that John Adams would want us to go to. But some of us like to think that Mr. Jefferson was a brilliant lawyer too, that he'd made some money as a lawyer as well. The biggest reason I think that Adams died in so much better financial conditions than either of his two Virginia successors, you know already if you brought your invitation with you, and that is his wife, Abigail. You know that he was gone from his family for pretty much that entire decade that surrounded the American Revolution, that is from 1774 to 1784, when Abigail finally sailed to Europe to join him after the war. And this is one of the things I like about that HBO movie. Who's by the way, has seen the HBO John Adams movie? Two-thirds of you have, so we have to talk about that movie, but I'm going to say that for Q&A. And in the moment, I'm going to talk about one thing I like about it, which is it really portrays her anguish at being separated from her husband for such a long period. Emotionally, it was these were the worst years of her life. Financially, however, leaving his family for 10 years was the best thing that John Adams ever did for that family, because it put Abigail not only in charge of the family farm, but the family finances, which she ran much better than he ever had. And I want to talk about 3 ways that she made John Adams a rich man in his absence. The first one began with a problem that a lot of families confront still today. That is, how do you get money? If one person in the family has gone away, how do you get some of the money home, some of your salary home to your family? You know, you could be a lady who crosses the border from Mexico to the U.S. and you got to send some money home to the family in Mexico. Or now you can send a MoneyGram, right? But that wasn't available. And so when John went to Europe for the first time in 1778, his idea once he got there was, okay, Abigail, I want you to get some of this money, so draw a bill of exchange on me. That's similar to a modern bank check. And you can kind of watch this letter that John sent to Abigail in, I think it was March of 1778. It takes, at the earliest, about 2 months for those letters to cross the ocean and reach Abigail back in Massachusetts. Actually, for you, I guess I should be going the other direction, shouldn't I, to get to Massachusetts. To reach Abigail, who says, okay, dear, if you want me to just draw an occasional bill of exchange on you, that's what I'll do. But, she said, I have a better idea. And that is, there is a war on. And the shelves of the shops in Boston, and especially in little towns like Braintree where they lived, were empty. A whole lot of what we think of people with spinning wheels, and there were spinning wheels out in the backcountry, but most of the cloth, for instance, that Abigail and her family wore, yes, she was the one who sewed it into clothing, but she bought it as cloth. She wasn't, you can't fit a loom in that little house that they grew up, that they raised their children in. These were not subsistence farmers. These are people who are really reliant on imports. And the British had a plan, which almost worked really, of strangling these 13 rebel colonies by blockading their trade with all parts of the world, as to quote the Declaration of Independence on that. And because of this blockade, the price of the few things that did make it through the blockade was astronomical. So Abigail's idea was, don't send me money, send me stuff. And you can watch that letter 2 months across to John, and to his great credit, he agreed to that idea. And he started sending her all these items. Cloth was the biggest thing, but finer things like china, a lot of women's fancy things like handkerchiefs and so forth. And they really transformed the relationship between Abigail and John, which I can illustrate by a shipment that he sent in 1780. He'd come back to Massachusetts very briefly and gone right back to Europe again. They had to put in at a Spanish port. And he sent her this big chest of Barcelona handkerchiefs. It was more than 300 of these handkerchiefs. And this arrived in Massachusetts in the middle of a sort of marital spat between John and Abigail, epistolary, over whether they should buy a new carriage or not. Abigail had been saying, it's embarrassing, you know, to go around in this old carriage. And John is a classic frugal Yankee New Englander. Well, it still rolls. So they'd gone back and forth. But those Barcelona handkerchiefs, which were a lady's item in those days, happened to be in such the height of fashion at the time that she sold them for enough money to go out and buy the carriage. Nothing John could do because A, he's 3,000 miles away, and B, she's done it with her own money. This was a risky trade. And John, after a while, said they had a couple of their shipments captured. And Abigail got a letter from John saying, having burned my fingers, I do not choose to meddle this way anymore. And you can see the letter that she writes back to John saying, okay, if you don't want to be involved in this trade, we won't. In another context, Abigail once said to John, your will is law to me. A classic 18th century woman in that sense. But she says, if you don't want to do this, we won't. It's your decision. But, she said, it's true this is a risky business, sending these shipments over to me. We're going to lose some. But, she added, to quote her, if 1 in 3 arrives, I should be a gainer. Which I take as the 18th century version of, you just don't get it, do you, John? but he did, and to his great credit, resumed the shipments. And it continued throughout the war. He still continued to worry about the risk of it. And at one point he said, oh, I got a way that we can continue this, but on a safer way. And that is, instead of sending these big chests like that one from Barcelona, I'm just going to have everybody who travels out from France, where he was at the time, to Massachusetts, bring a few things with you. And that way, I can reduce the risk by dispersing the risk. And he sent the first shipment in this new system of small little shipments, a lot of small ones instead of a few big ones every year. First one came in March of 1780 with the Marquis de Lafayette. And she got to meet the Marquis. She got these things, and that's all great. And she wrote John saying, okay, if you want to do it this way, that's fine. But there's a problem, and that is if you, instead of sending me a few big shipments a year, are going to just buy a few things here and there and send them to me, you're going to be having to buy those things retail. And you got to buy wholesale, was her point. That's where the money is. Eventually, John got out of the business altogether. Abigail corresponded directly with the merchants of Amsterdam and Paris, and everybody was a lot happier that way. So that's one of the ways that she helped make her husband a rich man while he was gone. Another was more of a long-term investment. You've all heard of the Green Mountain Boys, Ethan Allen. My students say furniture store. Yeah, I think it's his name after. But these were the people who were trying to create the state of Vermont and make it the 14th state. But it was not the 14th state during the Revolutionary War. It wanted to be. But the whole western half, say, of Vermont was claimed by New York. The other half of Vermont was claimed by New Hampshire. So it wasn't clear that Vermont was going to ever really come into existence as a state. And during this state of confusion, some of the people involved in this idea of Vermont came to Abigail and said, there's a lot of land up there. How would you like to get in on the ground floor? Abigail said, what's the maximum amount I can buy in any single town? And they said 330 acres. And she said, I'll take 330 acres in the name of my husband and in the name of each of my 4 children. The maximum she gets, for the 5 of them, 1,650 acres. The one person that she did not buy any land in the name of is who? Herself, because as a married woman, she's not allowed to be involved in these real estate transactions. She knew this was going to be tough with John. She said in her letter explaining all this transaction, I fear you will think I have gone Vermont mad. And he did. He wrote back saying, and you can hear John Adams, don't meddle anymore with Vermont. And she didn't, initially. But a couple years after that, her father died in September of 1783. And I told you that, many of you knew this already, that a married woman can't buy or sell property. But there's one thing that she can do, and that is inherit it. Now, she barely owns it, because having inherited, say, a piece of land, as Abigail inherited a piece of land from her father in 1783, she doesn't get the profits from it. Those goes to her husband to spend as he pleases. She doesn't control and say who we're going to rent it to. That's her husband's decision as well. She can't sell it. She can't even will it. It's divided among her children when she dies. So she really doesn't own it. That's why a lot of people just sort of round this thing off and say that women can't own property. Married women can't own property at all. But technically, she has one thing. If you're a woman who's married and you inherit a piece of property, your husband can't sell it unless you sign off on that transaction. And they used to actually, not in Massachusetts, but in Virginia, they used to actually take the woman aside, the wife aside, and say, is this really okay with you? And it was a little bit of a protection. Of course, the husband's going to know whether she said yes or no, but it was an attempt to protect these women. And so she had that power. She knew that this piece of land she'd inherited from her father, it was in a town called Northborough, probably Northborough, Massachusetts, or maybe Northbury, Connecticut, I'm not sure. But she knew that John wouldn't want to keep it. He only wanted land around his own house. And that gave her a bargaining chip. She wrote him in 1783 saying, I will sign off on you selling this Northborough land if you'll let me buy more land in Vermont. And the phrase she used was, I will make an exchange with you. Now, I have to say that John Adams did not go along with that, and she did not buy any more Vermont land. But the fact that she had used that phrase, I'll make an exchange with you, shows just how far this couple had diverged from that 18th century ideal of the family with as a castle and the man as the king. So Vermont was the second way she made a bunch of money. That was a longer term. They didn't pass it on to the kids, and the kids made money off of it. The third way that Abigail Adams made money for her husband during the Revolutionary War, I'll be very curious when we get to Q&A to hear your adjective for this, because mine is unscrupulous. You tell me. Here's the deal. You know that every major war that we've fought, including the ones we're in now, whether you totally oppose them, totally support them, this is the case, have to be paid for on credit. Especially true of our first war, because there was no treasury, there had been no government. And so you're a soldier fighting in the Continental Army, and I'm George Washington. I don't give you the only real money in those days was gold and silver coin. I don't have anything to give you. So they first got continental currency, which evaporated basically and became worth nothing. And so they settled with the soldiers after the war, gave them something called final settlement certificates. They were very similar to today's savings bonds. You remember, some of you remember war bonds, saying someday the U.S. government is going to give you $300, say, if that's how long you've been in. The problem, of course, for the soldiers, you can't eat someday. You got to have food and clothing and all that stuff now. And in those days, the Army, when you got mustered out, didn't even pay for your expenses on your trip home. And that is expensive. And so what many of the soldiers did was take those bonds and sell them at a fraction of their face value. I'll give you an example of one guy who, I hope this book is in the bookstore here at Monticello, because it's the best memoir of a Revolutionary War soldier, Joseph Plum Martin. His story is surprisingly funny a lot, sort of funny war stories, and tragic, of course, in many cases, and a lot of it is bitter. And it's especially bitter when he gets to the end of the war, when he was handled those final settlement certificates. And he says that what I did with mine was sell them to procure a decent suit of clothing so we could look something like ourselves when we came among our friends, and to pay our expenses home. Joseph Plum Martin had fought in the Continental Army for 7 years, and his final settlement certificates, his pay for that 7 years of service, gave him just enough money to buy that suit and to pay for those expenses. And other than that, he fought 7 years for our freedom for no pay. A very tragic situation for the soldiers. An amazing opportunity for people who have cash to buy these bonds. And Abigail figured out early on that this opportunity existed. She didn't buy directly from the soldiers. It was a market. They were advertised in the newspapers. And I'll tell you about one that she bought in particular. Her first purchase was a loan office certificate marked $100. But she didn't pay $100 for it. As I've said, these notes had really depreciated. She paid $24 for it. Now, there's some investors in the room probably. Her interest rate was 6% a year, okay? And I want you to tell me her annual rate of return. 6% a year. Now, that's figured not on the $24 that she paid, but on the $100. So she's getting $6 a year. What is it? 30% maybe? You're very close, 25%. She made a 25% annual return on that investment. So she'd made the whole thing back in 1 year and kept the principal, which was then redeemed at close to $100 after the Constitution was adopted. The bottom line is that she made a killing off of these bonds. And she only had one problem with it, a problem that can be summed up in 2 words. And those 2 words are John Adams. What a great place to talk about this, because we think of John Adams as the northern doppelganger for Thomas Jefferson, right? He's a lawyer. He's from that mercantile colony of Massachusetts. But he saw himself as first and foremost as a farmer. And we know, of course, it was Jefferson who said that those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had one. But Adams said very similar things. He said he wanted to embrace the town of Braintree with both his arms. That is, to buy up more and more land, not in these speculative purchases in places like Vermont, but just around his own farm. And that was his idea of how his money ought to be invested. So whereas she wanted to buy bonds, he wanted to buy land around his own house. They're just south of Boston. You can reach it on the subway line. At the end of the subway line now. That's where he wanted to buy land. And Abigail said, well, that's all well and good, but you're making about 1% a year on that land, and I can make you 25. And so this went back and forth. John saw these, in this debate between land and bonds, he saw land as safer not only for him as an individual. He almost, I have to say, sort of sounds like Scarlett O'Hara's father, land, Scarlett, but not your image of John Adams, I know. It's not only safer for the man, but it's safer for the country too. Because John saw these bond investors who were buying government notes. This was a long-standing belief in Britain. It went back decades in Britain that these people who were buying and selling government bonds, that this was what we would today call a special interest group, who had both the means to influence politicians. They could get them in early on an investment, and the motivation to influence politicians. And so he was very worried that they were, now we now know this is not true, of course, but John believed that there was such a thing as this dangerous special interest group that he wanted to combat. And while he's denouncing him, he wrote a letter to Jefferson, which I'm sorry to say, as a fan of John Adams, he actually did what many people who've denounced bond speculators did. He lapsed into anti-Semitism and referred to the people who were buying up these bonds at a fraction of their face value as Jews and Judaizing Christians. That is, this is usury. People shouldn't be doing this. Meanwhile, as he well knew, actually, Abigail was buying all these bonds in his name and making him a very wealthy man. It all came to a head after, 1783, the Revolutionary War ended, as you all know. We won the victory in Yorktown in 1781 here in Virginia, but John was one of the negotiators of the treaty in 1783. And then Abigail sailed over to Europe in 1784 to join John. And I have a letter that John wrote from Auteuil near Paris on April 24, 1785, to his new business agent who had replaced Abigail as his business agent back in Massachusetts when she came to Europe. And he's got some money coming to him, and look how he wants to invest this money. I wish you to repair the house in Boston and to go on purchasing bits of marsh and wood. So he's so eager to have land. Wood is good. That's firewood. So you want to buy a forest, but marsh? He's so eager to have land that he's wanting to buy swampland. Purchasing bits of marsh and wood if you can find them at moderate prices. But I'm not jealous about this. You may draw upon me to the amount of 300 pounds, when you please, and also to pay for Vesey's place, if he will sell it reasonably. This is a tract of land next to his house, and he really wanted to buy people next to him so no one would be tracking through his house on the way to their, no, through his land on the way to their land. And that was his idea, was just to build it for it. So he really wanted Vesey's farm. And so you've just heard me say, that's what he said in this letter. Use this money to buy Vesey's farm. Actually, that's what it says on the front of the letter. If you flip it over to the back of the same letter, you'll read these same words. You'll read these words. Shewing what I had written to Madam, she has made me sick of purchasing Vesey's place. Instead of that, therefore, you may draw upon me for 200 pounds at as good an exchange as you can obtain, and lay it out in such notes as you judge most for my interest, that is, bonds. Abigail had convinced John in the middle of writing this letter to switch from his favorite investment to her. And I'm not sure what the process, we see the result, but not the process. We do know that he often gave his letters to her to edit, even public statements that he'd made as president. We see her editing them. So that's possible that he gave it to her to check out. But I prefer to believe this different theory, which is that he's trying to write it really quick before Abigail can walk by and go, oh, no, you're not going to buy more land, are you? Whatever the result, she did get him to buy the bond. Well, I promised you two discoveries, and I'm going to mention the other one, and Ken, with a letter that Abigail wrote just 2 weeks after that one. That was April 24th, 85. This is also Abigail. This is also from near Paris, I'll tell you. Abigail, I think it's May 10th, 1785. She sent a letter also to the family business agent, Cotton Tufts, for whom Tufts University is named. She sent Tufts a letter saying that her son, John Quincy Adams, who you all know is the future president, he's coming home to get ready for Harvard. He's bringing some money with him. And she said in her letter to Tufts, with this money, which I call mine, I wish you to purchase certain bonds and set them aside for my pensioners. And I was really struck by that phrase, this money which I call mine. And once I'd seen it there, I started to look for it and find it in other places and see that actually for about 4 years, she'd taken some of that money that she'd been making for her husband and set it aside and called it her own. And by the time she wrote her will, which I have a copy of here, in 1816, 2 years before her death, she thought she was dying, but she actually lived another 2 years. By the time she wrote the will, she had about $5,000 worth of property of her own to distribute. And to get that into modern currency, multiply it times 20. It's about the modern equivalent of $100,000 worth of stuff. Now, as difficult as this is, since we're out here in this beautiful weather in this priceless spot, I want you for a minute to try to imagine that we're not here, but you're with me in the microfilm reading room of the Boatwright Library at University of Richmond, and I've gotten the microfilm. There's 600 reels, I didn't read them all, of the Adams papers. And I'm spinning through the reels, going through the years of Abigail's life, and I've come to 1816 when she writes this will. I know that she's going to die in 1818, only 2 years to go. And like most of her biographers, I go through chronologically, so I'm almost done. And I come to this will that she wrote, and it's on the microfilm chronologically in 1816. And there was something bothering me about Abigail Adams's will. And I wonder if it's bothering any of you as well. I almost just went on, described the contents of the will like all her other biographers did, and then moved on to her final couple of years and grandchildren and all that. And then she dies in October of 1818, 2 years later. I almost went on, but there was something bothering me about this will. You don't need to see any of the contents of it. You couldn't understand her handwriting if you could. She had terrible handwriting. By law, she had bad handwriting because she was a woman. She hadn't gotten much of a formal education. What's wrong with this will? Exactly. How could she even write a will? The main thing a will does, and it's what hers does, is distribute property. As a married woman, she was not allowed to own property. Of course, if she'd been single or a widow, have all those property rights, the same rights that men did. But I probably should have reminded you that in 1818, her husband was very much still alive. He would outlive her and of course die on July 4th, 1826, the same day as somebody else, but I can't remember who. And so she's a married woman. Her husband's living. She's not supposed to own any property. She's not supposed to have any property to deed, and yet she did it anyway. And discovering that made me go back to try to see when did she start separating dad's money from mom's money, and it seems like it was about in the fall of 1781, right about the time of the Battle of Yorktown. And this part is pure speculation, but I think the reason for that, that she had famously, you wouldn't know this from watching the HBO John Adams movie, but she famously wrote the Remember the Ladies letter to John saying, when you write that code of laws, remember the ladies. And of course, John wrote back scoffing, I cannot but laugh, he wrote, at this idea, and they didn't. By the fall of 1781, it was clear the Founding Fathers had won the Revolutionary War, but that the Founding Mothers had not. And this is when I think she decided, I can't change the law. She continued to complain about this, but she stopped making demands and only complained. There's a difference between a demand and a complaint, isn't there? And what she did was, I can't change the law, so I'm going to defy the law. And she set up her home as sort of a lab to experiment with the idea, what would it be like if women could own property? And let's look at what she did with this money. You might be a widow living in, the town was called Quincy after 1792, their part of Braintree became Quincy. And you'd be, on your front porch churning butter or whatever, and here comes a wagon load of firewood or a side of beef, or maybe just a few dollars of cash. And the guy who's driving the cart claims he doesn't even know who it came from, or he won't tell you. That's a gift from Abigail. These are the people she was referring to when she said that money was a fund for my pensioners. Almost all of her recipients of her charity were women. One of them I want to draw particular attention to. Her name is Phoebe Abdy. And until Abigail's father died in September of 1783, she had been an Adams family slave. And this is a valuable reminder that we think of slavery as a Southern institution, but there were slaves in all 13 of the states that rebelled. Finally, in 1783, the same year that Abigail's father died, and he actually said she could be free in her will, he had to actually, because earlier that year the Massachusetts State Supreme Court, citing the state Bill of Rights, all men are born equally free, had freed the slaves of Massachusetts. So Phoebe was freed in 1783, but she was already a very old lady. Now, she would live until 1812. I don't know how old she was when she died. I can't find her birth date, but she was already old in 1783. And she could do things. She did take in washing and stuff, but she was really in tough financial straits. And so Abigail would send her stuff, and Abigail, for the rest of Phoebe's life, put Phoebe in one of the Adams properties, in one of the houses, first for nothing and then at a way below market rent. And Abigail would get reports from her sisters in Europe and then down in New York and Philadelphia when her husband was vice president and president on Phoebe and how she was taking care of these houses that she was allowed to basically house sit in. And the reports were all positive except for one thing, and that is that Phoebe consistently insisted that on taking into that house other people who were even more desperate than herself, homeless people, who she welcomed in that. Let me give you a couple of quotes from these. This is a letter that Abigail's sister wrote to Abigail when Abigail was First Lady, didn't use the term at the time, in January 1798. She seems to have a house full of black and white about her. That is, by 1780, yeah, initially she just seemed to be taking in black people, but she's taking in blacks and whites by the 1790s. And it's an ongoing battle between the Adams, between Abigail on the one hand, Abigail and her sister, and her uncle, who's the business agent, telling Phoebe, you're welcome to stay in the house, but we don't want you taking these other people. Here's Mary writing Abigail in March of 1788. I talked to her yesterday, to Phoebe yesterday, and charged her to bolt her door against them. But she wouldn't do it. She insisted on extending charity, just as Abigail had insisted on extending charity to her. A couple of Abigail's other pensioners were her own sisters. Her older sister, Mary, had married a preacher, which is another way of saying that he was poor, and she was poor. And her younger sister, Elizabeth, had done even worse in the marriage market. She had married a genius. Richard Cranch was self-taught in ancient Hebrew and Greek and Latin, he wrote all these biblical prophecies and stuff, but as a practical matter, he failed at spermaceti oil, he failed at making wool cards, for carding out wool. He failed he's finally settled down as a watchmaker. And I have to tell you, even though we're hawking books over here, that I couldn't resist saying in my book that as a watchmaker, he was like the things he was making, that is, moving around but not really getting anywhere. And the Cranch family, they were the Cranches, their finances went down, 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 even as the Adams family finances went up and up. And so Abigail would do little things for Mary, but it all really came to a head in what I would say one of the most difficult moments of Abigail's entire life. Let me take you there. It's July of 1789. And Abigail is down in still New York at that point, and her husband has just become, New York was the capital for the first year under the Constitution. So she's down in New York City, where her husband has just become vice president, and Abigail gets a letter from her sister Mary back in Massachusetts saying, aha, and now your husband is vice president. What a relief that is to me, a relief. Now your husband is finally in a position to do something for my husband. That is to get him a job with the federal government. And I ask you to put yourself in Abigail's shoes when she received that letter from Mary Cranch, who was not only her sister, she was her older sister, and she was her best friend, other than John Adams. And so she would do anything for Mary. And yet what Mary's asking here to get a job for Richard Cranch is an impossible thing, because Abigail knows that there's just nothing. There's no position in the federal government that Richard Cranch can bring any credit to. So what do you do in that position? And I have to tell you guys that talking about my book out in Colorado State a couple of years ago, in a big auditorium, students, I think they'd been forced to go, and one of them from the upper row yells, "Create a new federal job for him." Which would have solved it, but that was not really an option. And so Abigail had to write her sister Mary, who's made this one request. She had to write her and say, no, I can't do this. But she was able to soften the blow a little bit by doing something else. And that is by saying to Mary, look, over the years, you've run up a pretty big debt to me. I sent you stuff from Europe, and I've, little things here and there. And we've always assumed you're going to pay me back someday, but you know what? You don't have to pay me back. We're going to wipe the slate clean. All you have to do is draw up a statement of the debt and find out the exact number and send it to me, and I will send you a receipt, and that will clear the debt. And that's the one thing I can do for you. That created still one problem, though. Oh, I should say first that Abigail said to Mary, I feel entitled to doing, I don't remember her exact words, I feel entitled to do this without asking John, or without telling John, because this is, as she called it, my own pocket money. You know, I told you the phrase before, my own money, which I call mine. Now it's my own pocket money. So she wants to keep John out of the loop, but that's going to be tough because the vice president had a nasty habit of reading his wife's mail. So how's she going to? She's got to get that piece of paper with a number on it from Mary before she can write this receipt and clear the debt. So okay, here's a solution. Abigail's down in Richmond Hill, which is in part of Greenwich Village now, in a beautiful house on the hill there, and she says to Mary, send me the statement, but put that in a letter to me, but put that in a letter to my married daughter, Nabby, who's living with me here. Because the vice president didn't open his daughter's mail, just his wife. Okay, fine. Still a problem, though, because postage was really expensive, and much more than we complain about today, and it was paid by the recipient. And Abigail didn't want to saddle her daughter with that or have to settle with her daughter or whatever. Okay, there's a solution for that, too. Here's what Abigail wrote her sister Mary up in Massachusetts, directing her to do. Draw up a statement of how much the debt is so that I can clear it. Put that statement in a letter to me. Put that letter to me in a letter to my daughter. Put that letter to my daughter in a letter to John Adams, because what do federal officials still have today? The franking privilege. So John gets this letter. I'm vice president. I just sign right up here in the upper right-hand corner, so I receive it postage free. And then I open it up and see, oh, it's actually a letter to my daughter, Nabby, so gives it to Nabby, and Nabby opens it and says, oh, it's actually a letter to my mom, Abigail, who gives it to Abigail, and the debt is cleared. So that's the extent to which she was willing to go to conceal this money, my own property money, my pen money, sometimes she called it, from her husband, but she didn't always keep it from him. And I want to give you the sort of counterexample. For this, I have to go way back to December 1783, when she, early on, but she still had a bunch of this money. And she wrote a letter to John in December 1783. She's in Massachusetts. He's over in Europe. She hasn't seen him for 5 years, and she misses him terribly, and she'll do anything to bring him home. And this is when that Vesey property that I mentioned before first came on the market, and Abigail wrote him saying, we can get the Vesey property. But there's a problem, and that is you don't have enough money, and I don't have enough money on hand in your account to buy it, and so we're going to have to borrow the money. And all of John's and Abigail's biographers mention this letter where she offers to borrow the money to buy the Vesey farm for John, because it runs so counter to Abigail's and John's shared aversion to going into debt. But she was willing to borrow the money to buy this farm because she knew he really wanted it on one condition. And I'm going to read that part of the letter, and by the time I'm done, you're going to know where she was going to borrow this. Some of you may already know. If, my dear friend, you will promise to come home, take the farm into your own hands and improve it. Let me turn dairywoman. And as this is similar to the quote that you read, and assist you in getting our living this way, instead of, you know, this is a Xerox, but somebody said, does he have the original letter up there? I've been doing this a lot. Instead of running away to foreign courts and leaving me half my life to mourn in widowhood, then I will run you in debt for this farm. To whom was she going to run him in debt? Herself. She was willing to give him this money from her own account if he would come home. John did not come home, and she kept that money and built it up to the, as I said, $5,000 or modern equivalent of $100,000 that she left in her will. Let me say 3 things about that will before hearing your questions and thoughts. You're probably wondering, who'd she give the money to? Well, remember that I said that she had these 2 sisters who were really in tough financial shape. Both of those sisters had sons who were in bad shape. Abigail's brother's family was in even worse shape. There's clearly an alcohol gene in the Smith family, her father's family, because her brother, like 2 of her sons, drank himself to death. And before drinking himself to death in 1787, William Smith had a bunch of sons, and they were in bad shape in 1816, several of them financially. So she's got all these grandsons her in really terrible shape economically when she wrote her will. She also has a bunch of nephews who, I mentioned the nephews. Grandchildren, I should mention too. Her parents didn't want her to marry John Adams. They wanted her to marry up, and that was not an up. And she defied them. Her children did the same thing to her. All of them married down. But that meant that a lot of John Quincy was doing okay, but her other children were all doing not well financially in 1816 when she wrote her will. One of them had died. But my point is, she had a lot of grandsons who were in real tough financial straits in 1816, along with all those nephews who were really hurting in 1816. And she left them nothing. She left it all to her nieces and her daughters-in-law and her granddaughters and her female servants. She left it all to women. Not, I think, out of any animosity against her male descendants, but for two reasons. Number one, women were more dependent than men, were becoming more so in the 19th century than they had been in the 18th century, but also for another reason. If you think about these gifts that she's giving to people like Louisa Catherine Adams, who is married to the future president, John Quincy Adams, she's a married woman just like Abigail. She doesn't have any more right to receive this gift than Abigail does because they're both married women. And I think that was actually precisely her point. Having spent the previous 30 years amassing a fortune in her own name in defiance of centuries of law that said that married women can't do that, she was now doing what she could to allow these other women, if they chose to make the same claim. I mentioned that Louisa Catherine was one of the heirs. She did a very strange decision, made a very strange decision after Abigail's death. Abigail had left her $300, which 150 of it she kept. The other 150, she directed Abigail's son, who was her executor, to not even give to her, but to give it directly to her three sons. You know them. Charles Francis Adams is the most famous. I think the others are John and George. John Quincy Adams' three sons. He only had sons. And Louisa Catherine gave half this money to those three sons, directly defying what Abigail had tried to do in giving everything to women. And so maybe Abigail, peering down from heaven, was angry about that. But here's a reason to think she was not angry at all. Because when Louisa Catherine Adams, Mrs. John Quincy Adams, took that money and on her own authority gave it to those three boys, she affirmed what the law for centuries had denied and what Abigail for the last 30 years had been insisting on, and that is that the money was hers to give. The last thing to say about the will is, what's John Adams' role in all of this? When he found this document in his wife's papers after her death, he's the man in the castle. He would have been perfectly within his rights in just throwing it in the fire. What he actually did was comply with it to the letter. And by doing that, he turned it into a legal document because Abigail, on the eyes of the law, had been acting as his representative. I want to say in closing that this is the most illustrious couple of the founding era, and they're famous for a whole lot of collaborations. But this collaboration, in which the wife and not the husband took the leading role, and I'd say it's the collaboration that led John Adams to do the most radical thing he ever did by going along with this will, because when he signed on to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, he only affirmed that all men were created equal. This collaboration, to me, is their most extraordinary of all. So thank you very much. Thanks. Now, Ian, are you going to try to get a microphone to the person asking questions? I can pick it up here. You can pick it up, okay. So you're going to take them?
Woody, I'm looking forward to reading the book. I've always been very intrigued by the London years of the Adamses. John Adams was the first ambassador to Britain, and they lived in Grosvenor Square, which is exactly the same place where the current American embassy is situated.
I did not know that.
And they were living opposite to Lord North,
Right.
being the Prime Minister who waged the tea tax and the coercive acts. And in fact, Abigail wrote home saying, we're still opposite Lord North. He's still on the other side. He never comes over to us. But she rather liked her time in Britain. She met George III. They were popular at court. The only thing that alarmed her about George III was his beetle white eyebrows. I wondered if you wanted to say anything more about her London years when she did get to be reunited with John, and they seem to have had a really marvellous time.
I totally agree with you on that, Andrew. And I think she really surprised herself by that. That she came like many Americans in London. Andrew probably on their first trip to London came with a bad attitude, But she really kept surprising herself by how much she loved London, and particularly, I just actually had a student write a paper about her views of London before and after Paris, and she already surprised herself in the short visit she made to London in 1784 on the way to Paris. She already liked it a lot, but she liked it even more after Paris, and I think that helped. I can't resist telling you about one other thing she did while she was in Paris. Her daughter, Nabby, and I call her Nabby just to distinguish her from Abigail because her name was also Abigail, but she had almost married a man named Royal Tyler back in 1783 and 1784. He had been a real rake at Harvard. Abigail didn't know this, but he'd knocked up one of the cleaning ladies at Harvard. But they do know that he'd had a rakish past, and the question was how much had he reformed. John was initially against that marriage, but he eventually came around and wrote Abigail 2 letters saying, you can go ahead and let these two marry. This is in the spring of 1784, before you sail to London. Those letters were sent, one in February and one in March. They didn't leave till June. There was plenty of time for those letters to cross the ocean and get into Abigail's hands so that she could deliver them to Nabby, so that Nabby could marry the man she wanted to. And they never arrived. And Abigail had turned against Royal Tyler herself by that time, especially by the influence of her sister with whom he was boarding, and had all sorts of bad reports. And it's pretty clear to me that she burned those 2 letters, so that she can bring Nabby with her to London and get him away from this guy, get Nabby away from this guy, but without having the responsibility being on Abigail. Yes.
Just stepping aside from Abigail for a minute, you had some comments about the HBO special on John Adams.
Oh, thank you so much for asking about that. Well, I already mentioned one thing that's so sad. I thought it's one of those movies that you want to watch with the sound off, because I thought the people's clothes and seeing somebody tarred and feathered and all those things. There's an amazing depiction, some of you remember, of smallpox inoculation. A little bit exaggerated. They had this dead guy being carted around, and that's not how they did it. But the image of her trying to spirit up her. Let's see, Tommy was 4, and I have a 4-year-old, and trying to imagine to inspire my 4-year-old to be willing to be inoculated. Those of you who haven't seen it or don't know about this, before the cowpox virus, the way to get inoculated against smallpox was to get smallpox, and they would cut a little slit in your arm and then take the pus from somebody who had it and put it into your arm. And so I thought the movie, Laura Linney, talking her kids into this, and the kids trying to be brave. I thought, so some of the scenes were really wonderful, but here are some of my issues with it. She wrote dozens of letters, not only to John, but to other men and to women that she knew, advocating for women's education in particular, and none of that is in there. It's partly these 2 actors. Paul Giamatti has these kind of bugged out eyes, which I think was good for conveying John Adams' passion. The problem in the movie is they portrayed him as all excitable, and Abigail's sort of the port in the storm. And it is true that John Adams, at some point in his career, hated, we'll start with Mr. Jefferson, since we already know about that. But he also hated Ben Franklin and John Hancock, Mercy Otis Warren. Help me, others. Hamilton, of course, everybody hated Hamilton. Just about anybody you can name other than Washington, who was beyond reproach. My point is, John did hate all these people, but everybody that John hated, Abigail hated more. So yes, sometimes she was the port in the storm as she's depicted. The movie kind of makes her out to be June Cleaver, now Wallace, calm down. But just as often, she was the storm. And you can see why. Somebody asked me recently, down in Florida, someone said, do you think she would have made a better president than him? In some ways, yes. She was certainly brilliant, but you have to imagine a situation where women, because I think she would have been a different person if she had been a person who could run for president. Because she was a woman, because she was out of the direct line of fire, she didn't have to be as diplomatic as John did in their letters. I think of it, my wife, don't anybody look this up, but my wife had a boss who she hated once. And I hated the boss a lot more than my wife did. And I think that's, because I had to hear about this boss all the time. And I think Abigail was kind of like that. So the movie portrays her, and it's really sad that it conveys her sort of a quiet strength, but not her feistiness, I think, is missing from the movie. I mentioned Phoebe Abdi, who had been one of the slaves who raised her. I should also mention, I think it's during the smallpox epidemic, they show her scrubbing the floor. And she did get on her hands and knees and work, but she was never without servants. In the movie, you see her with about 30 servants. In France, she actually had 8. But my point is, in the movie, she's shown as never having servants in America and always having them in Europe. The reality is she always had servants, but I think they felt that a modern audience couldn't relate to her if they honestly portrayed her servants. And along those lines, there's a lot of what I call well bucket history, where in order to bring John up, they bring other people down. They show him as the only person opposing tarring and feathering. A, he didn't oppose it, and B, so A, he didn't oppose it, so they just made that up. They show the town of Boston. Everyone wants to hang those British soldiers who had fired at the Boston Massacre, and John is the lawyer that got them off in defiance of the whole. Everyone in the town hated John for doing that. Well, actually, the town of Boston elected him to the legislature during that very summer that he was preparing the Boston Massacre trial. Everybody knew what side he was on. And so that's that sort of well bucket thing to make everybody else look bad in order to make him look. But I have to tell you one more thing as a parent. There's a scene where the American wounded from the Battle of Bunker Hill are parading past the Adams family home in Braintree. And I'm not mad about that. The geography of that is wrong. They wouldn't go past that. That's not the issue. The issue is that, so the kids, the whole family's in front of the house, and the soldiers are parading by. And her sons are seeing all these mangled and mutilated soldiers, and she goes in, and all the children go running in the house. And then later that night, Abigail and John are talking by the fire, and the kids are supposed to be up in bed, and the kids are kind of coming down, spying on them to see what's going on. And Abigail says, "Ben," and the kids all come running up to. And I got to tell you, my house is not run like that. I wish it was. Yes, sir.
It seems as though the primary source documentation for anything having to do with Abigail Adams are the letters that she wrote and received. My question is in 2 parts. One, so many of them seem to have survived, and I wonder how that all happened when so many others that wrote letters certainly have not survived. And number 2, is there any evidence that she ever wrote anything beside letters? Did she keep a diary? Is there anything that gives us some insight into how she really thought, as opposed to what did she say to other people?
That's a wonderful question. She kept a diary once in her life, and that is on that ocean voyage. She hated the idea of going out on the ocean. She hated traveling in general. One of the things I've been stressing her sort of proto-feminist side, but I can sort of make the case for the other side too. She never once got on a horse, for instance. And she saw, John once said something totally sexist pig. I'm getting to your question, but John once said, "There's nothing more odious than a woman at sea." And Abigail said, "You're right." And so this was a big thing for her, and she did keep a journal of that. But the journal, even that, was meant to be shared. And so there's very few, other people can help me. Where's Jeff Looney? There's very few things that people wrote then that they really expected no one to ever read. Right? Maybe Jefferson didn't expect anybody to look at the Commonplace book, where he's copying down quotations from other people. But like we have a diary Landon Carter kept while he was the master of Sabin Hall over on the Rappahannock River. And he says, maybe when someone reads this, they'll see that I was right and they were wrong, constantly. And so the sort of the notion that we have of a private diary with a lock, and no one's ever going to see it but you, is, I think, even religious diaries. I don't know, what do you think about this, Andrew? There's not a lot of private writings in the sense of I don't expect anyone to ever see it that would give us that kind of picture. Am I right? Can you think of anything Jefferson wrote that he really thought no one would ever see? I mean, something significant that he really didn't expect to get seen.
There's lots of stuff he didn't expect anyone to see in his life, but I think he was writing for always.
Yes, certainly by retirement. Those are public documents. He knows those are going to be public documents, don't they? Yeah. But anyway, so we don't have a lot. Why did those letters survive? I give her a lot of the credit for the fact that the letters survive, paradoxically, because she often wrote in her letters, "Oh, my writing is so bad," and so forth. Here, I'll show you. That she'd say, "Burn this," because she was embarrassed by her bad handwriting and by not having time to make a copy and so forth. John had a secretary, but she didn't. But so on the one hand, she was trying to not have these things survive. But here's why so many. There are 608 reels of Adams microfilm that were made back in the 1950s, and that's because the Adams kept their house all the way into the 20th century when it went to a family trust, and now it's in the Park Service's hands. And so, to me, the bigger surprise is that so much of Mr. Jefferson's letters have survived when his family lost this house.
He made copies of them. He had a magic machine that did that.
All right,
she sent these letters off to somebody. How did they...
John was a great pack rat. Well, I'd say two things. One, I do think many more letters from that era survive than the letters that you and I are writing because, I sent a thank you note to my aunt. She's not going to save it. But the letters that she's writing, they do have personal reflections, but a lot of it is, do you want to buy this piece of land? And so it's business correspondence. And so I think you have to compare her letters more to the letters you write at work than to the letters you write at home. And your work letters, don't most companies are very...
But she wrote to all these other men, too. That wouldn't have had anything to do with their family business.
Well, for instance, the letters to Jefferson, they are... There's very few, help me on this, but very few of her letters to Jefferson are merely, hey, how's it going? How's Maria Causeway? Or it's buy me some more, buy me this, and I bought this for you.
Also, they're shopping they do for each other.
Yeah. So it's... I do think that's one reason that you'd be surprised at how many. We have 2,000 letters that Judith Sargent Murray wrote, who was a contemporary of Abigail's and a great fan. Those were just recently discovered about 20 years ago in Mississippi, of all places. She was another New Englander, but ended her life in Mississippi. So I'm just saying that it's more easy to understand it if you say two things. A, this is business correspondence, even though it's also personal correspondence, and most of us are better about saving business correspondence. And two, that the family was doing so well financially, I think largely through her efforts, although we don't have the business records to back that up, if that's based on the letters too. But the family did so well that they were able to keep the house and keep there was a separate stone library that was part of that house that it was all preserved in until the modern era.
We can take one more question.
Yeah, I know y'all are probably freezing. Yes.
You wondered how we would differ in our adjective compared to your unscrupulous regarding bonds. I use the adjective smart. Smart.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Shall we?
Yes.
Adjourn. Thank you very much. On behalf of the signed book, we have a reception now? Oh, yeah. Thank you.